Greetings gamers, over the last few weeks I've been making a new Homebrew campaign setting for D&D or other tabletop RPGs. In that time we've learned quite a bit about this new country, the country of Ashk. We know about some of the customs of the country, we know some of the geography from the map that we made, and we also know a little bit about how gods are worshipped in this country. Well, today I want to explore the central tension, the central conflict of our campaign setting. It isn't always necessary to have some kind of central conflict in your campaign, but I feel like when you have two opposing factions in some kind of conflict, it creates much more drama for your campaign setting as a whole. Even if your players don't engage with the central conflict as such and don't align themselves with either side, it's good to have something in place so that the players can see the ever-changing world around them and the results of this conflict as it unfolds. A really good example of this in other media is the video game Skyrim. In that game, your main plot, if you will, is the Dragonborn trying to stop the dragon Alduin, but there's a whole backdrop of the Skyrim Civil War that you don't have to engage with, but you see the ripples of that conflict throughout the game. There are NPCs who will treat you differently depending on the side you choose. There are NPCs who will treat you differently depending on whether or not you choose a side, and you see the results of that conflict throughout the main story. So in our first episode, we talked about the idea of having a foreign emperor who's come to Ashk to conquer the city-states, the super cities, under a single ruler. And I think that is a really good starting point for our central conflict. But two factions that are just fighting each other isn't enough. We need to think deeper and think about what each side of this conflict represents, so we get a deeper understanding of why the people of the country would side with one or the other. The easiest way for us to do this is to decide what defines Ashk as a place and then put this new empire in opposition of it. So to get started, I've got a new page here in my OneNote document, and we know that our central conflict is going to be Ashk versus the Empire. Further on from that, we know that Ashk is a place that's steeped in tradition and they have families that go back for dozens of generations. So one of the cornerstones of this conflict should be the old versus the new. But if Ashk is the old, how can we make this empire into the new? One way to do this is to think about how power is obtained, how political power is obtained in these two sides, these two factions. In Ashk, power is gained by the wealthy and it's passed down through families. So in opposition to that, we should have the Empire have more of a democratic process where the people choose the power. Following on from this, we can address the matter of wealth inequality, the rich versus the poor. So in Ashk, there is a really big wealth divide. The ruling class, the people that have the most money in the cities, are vastly more wealthy than those who make up the majority of the common folk. So to create an interesting tension in this old versus new, rich versus poor dynamic between Ashk and the Empire, I think we should have the Empire offer some sort of basic income to its citizens, or maybe as the Empire moves through and conquers manufacturing, maybe they give a small portion of that money, that gold generated by the things they conquer, back to the people. Another key issue between the city-states and the invading Empire would be slavery. A huge portion of Ashk's current income comes from slavery, and the Empire would be very anti-slavery and have the position to abolish slavery. That's great for the slaves in Ashk, but for anyone who owns slaves, who makes money from them, or hopes to one day own slaves and be in that position of wealth, the Empire is a threat to that way of life. Following on from this idea, the military of Ashk is quite slavery based. The average citizen in Ashk doesn't need to worry about fighting in a war because there are owned people, there are slaves that will fight their wars for them. Whereas if the Empire doesn't have slavery, to be able to conquer vast amounts of land, the Empire's going to need some sort of conscription service. So there'll be a lot of people who are opposed to the Empire because they don't want to have to be on the front lines, putting their lives at danger. They'd rather other people, even if it is slaves, being the ones to do that. Another really big point of conflict between people on either side of this would be federal versus states' rights. At the moment in Ashk, the country is made up of these super cities, these city-states that each have their own customs, their own laws, and they largely govern themselves. Whereas the Empire is hoping to unify all these under a single banner, under a single set of laws, and would take away a lot of the super cities' freedoms to make their own decisions. So that's going to be a really important point to a lot of people, that they don't want some foreign empire coming here and telling them that they can't do X, Y, or Z because the city-state that they live in has been conquered. One of the biggest freedoms that the city-states lose if they are conquered by the Empire would be the freedom of religion. So presently in Ashk, the common folk are largely free to worship whichever god they want, and there's no real stigma about worshipping any particular god. Whereas the Empire should be a monotheistic empire, so they should have a single god, and part of their condition for becoming a citizen and gaining the benefits of being a citizen, like the stipend that they would get from the Empire controlling production, or the lack of slavery, would be that they would have to accept the Empire's religion. So a lot of people in Ashk, while they might be very anti-slavery, or they might be very poor and would benefit from a monetary standpoint from being part of the Empire, they would lose their access to their religion. So they're not necessarily going to join up with the Empire because they would lose their religion. In terms of what religion the Empire should worship, I think Sophos, the grandfather, who in my setting is the first god, the god that brought the other deities into being, should be who the Empire worships. When you have such a diverse pantheon as you do in most D&D or tabletop RPG games, having such a large empire devoted to a really niche and specific god doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me. I think it makes much more sense for them to worship a more father figure, a more one god type of deity, whilst also acknowledging that these other gods exist. They can use the excuse of, oh, this is the first god, so this is the god that we worship. So this conquering empire would worship Sophos, the grandfather, who is the supposed first god and who brought all the other deities into being. And a condition of becoming a citizen of the empire would be that you have to convert to the Church of Sophos. So now we've got some really good cornerstones to this conflict. We've got some really good reasons for people to choose one side or the other, whether they're pro or anti-slavery, whether they have wealth or whether they're poor, whether they're in favour of individual rights or collective rights, and whether they are in favour of personal choice of religion, or whether they worship Sophos, the grandfather. Using these points, we can create some really interesting and deep factions and NPCs, and there can be a lot of nuance that we might not otherwise get if we didn't have these opposing tensions represented by each side of the conflict. So, for example, the players might come across an NPC who is utterly and staunchly opposed to slavery, but they might worship Koros, the goddess of decay. So they wouldn't join the Empire and they'd be opposed to the Empire because they would lose their religion, and their religion might be a really important part of their sense of self. So they wouldn't want to give that up, even though joining the empire and supporting the empire would mean that slavery would be abolished. The great thing about doing all this work is that our players never have to pick a side in this. They never have to be working for the city-states against the empire. They don't have to go off and join the empire to conquer Ashk. They don't have to interact with this at all, but the fact that this conflict is going on in the background will give richer interactions and a deeper world for them to play around in, because things will be happening around them. They'll hear about conflicts in far distant places, or they might be present in a city-state in one of the super cities when it comes under siege. And even though they're not in favour of the things that the super cities, the city-states represent, they might end up having to fight against the empire just to defend themselves while they're living in this city or adventuring in this city. So there we have it. After a really small amount of work, we have a great starting point for our central tension, our central conflict. And we can build upon that as we learn more about Ashk and as we learn more about the Parthian Empire, the empire that's coming in and conquering. We can add smaller elements, we can add new things to this central tension to make it even more rich and deep. But this is a great starting point and will really help inform us going forward when we start making factions and start making NPCs, because we can contextualize them within this tension, within the city-states versus the empire. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video and have been enjoying the series in general. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with all of the new episodes. And if there's anything in particular about world building and about building your own homebrew campaign setting that you'd like to see, post in the comments below and let me know. But until next time, happy gaming. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for new content every single Friday. And if you want to keep watching, well, there's another couple videos for you to watch just over there. Happy gaming.